Well, hello, church history friends. Thank you for joining us today as we welcome Andrew Bolton and hear the fascinating story of Charles Derry, the historic RLDS missionary. The spring lecture series is not only a great way to learn church history, it's also an opportunity to help support church heritage. Donations received during the lecture series will go to developing new educational programs. It'll help fund young adults in the Alma Blair internship program at the historic sites, and it'll support continuing education and maintenance and preservation for all 5 Community of Christ historic sites. Joey will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chats. Thank you all for supporting church heritage. It's also my great pleasure to welcome Kristen Mackay today. Kristen is the site director at the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo, Illinois, and she's also the president of the the John Whitmer Historical Association. Kristen is here to tell us about some of the things that are happening with our friends at John Whitmer. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, Barb. Hello, everyone. I'm here to invite you to attend the John Whitmer Historical Association Conference this September. It's the 50th anniversary of the association, which was founded by RLDS Community of Christ history folks like Dick and Barbara Howard, Grant McMurray, Alma Blair, Pat Spillman, and Bill Russell, just to name a few. We hope you'll all join with us at the Independence Temple in Independence on September 15th through 18th as we celebrate the golden anniversary. To register, go to jwha.info for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. I also want to take a moment to introduce you to a few folks with us today. Joey Williams is joining us from Independence, Missouri, and he'll be with us throughout the lecture series as our host, introducing the speakers and helping moderate the discussions. Welcome, Joey. Our second co-host helping out behind the scenes is Peter Smith, a familiar face for many of you. Peter was here when we launched our first lecture series in 2020, 2 years ago, and he's continued on helping us out as a co-host ever since, and we are forever, forever grateful. Welcome, Peter. Now I'll turn the microphone over to you, Joey, to share the plan for today's program and to tell us all about our guest speaker.
Well, thank you, Barb. I am so happy to be back for another church history lecture, and especially to be here with one of my good friends and mentor, Andrew Bolton. The schedule for today's program can be found in the chat. And also to let you know, there's a Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. So don't be shy, use that function whenever you think of a question for our speaker. But it's important to note that there's a Q&A button, but there's also a chat button, and those two are different. So make sure that you're posting questions, any questions you might have in the Q&A function. And we'll go over those questions at the end of our presentation. So Charles Derry is a familiar historic name for many people in Community of Christ, especially those with roots in Western Iowa and Great Britain. In fact, I'd like to run a quick poll with our audience to see how many of you have a historical connection to Charles Derry. Now, perhaps Derry was the missionary that introduced one of your ancestors to the RLDS Church, or maybe he helped found your congregation or reunion grounds. Perhaps he was from the same part of England where your family is from. Barb is putting a poll up for us, and I hope that you'll answer the question, does your family, your congregation, your reunion ground, etc., have a historical connection to Charles Derry? So go ahead and click yes or no to answer this question, and I'll give you a few seconds to do that. It looks like quite a few people, 18% at least of the people who are here today have some type of connection with Charles Derry. So thank you for taking that poll. Now allow me to introduce today's speaker. Andrew Bolton is joining us today from his home in Leicester, England, which in fact, a few years ago was my home. For all of you who are wondering, yes, Andrew was a wonderful landlord. Andrew has been in many roles throughout his career and life. He was a high school teacher in religious studies in Britain, a teacher trainer at Westminster College, Oxford, and an educational advisor for the Leicester School District. He then worked for Community of Christ at their international headquarters in Independence. And for the first 12 years, he coordinated peace and justice ministries. And then for 9 years, he coordinated pastoral care and mission for 250 congregations in 10 Asian countries. He currently lives with Jewel in Leicester, and together they work as church volunteers in many meaningful projects, one of which is the renovation of the famous Little Blue Church in Leicester, which is a congregation that's dear to my heart when I was living there. I remember one of the very first days when Andrew and Jewel returned to live in Leicester. I was at the church for a coffee morning, and while sipping on my cup of joe, I spotted Andrew outside of the window on a ladder, inspecting the siding and the roof, all excited to get the congregation started working on this renovation and restoration project. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to you as we are all eager to learn more about the RLDS missionary and hymn writer, Charles Derry.
Thank you, Joey. So Charles Derry, he lived 95 years, born 1826, died the year my mum was born, 1921. So he's the first missionary of the Reorganization to the British Isles. He arrives in Britain in 1863. He's a key figure in the Reorganization. In fact, more important than I had realized. He wrote an autobiography, which is not published by our church, but by Price Publishing, and it's only $10. It's worth every cent. It's a really good story. And he also wrote lots of articles, journals, letters, and over 200 poems, and some hymns. And we'll have one hymn sung in a little while. So we have lots of stuff to read about Charles Derry. He's good for historians. He leaves a generous legacy of writing. So let's talk a little bit about the background. So we talk about the dark and cloudy day, 1844, when Joseph's assassinated, to 1852 is the first period I want to talk about. So there's controversy, there's division in the church and the states, but the church members in the British Isles were not really aware of what was happening. They had no inkling about polygamy, for instance, and they were happy to trust the apostles who they knew. So we have an undivided, I would say, church preaching the Kirtland gospel in the British Isles, which was enormously successful. So by 1852, 80% of all Latter-day Saints are British born and British baptized, and 60% of all Latter-day Saints in the world are still living in Britain. So this is a big, important story. But then in 1853, polygamy is published on the front page of the Millennial Star in January 1853. And in November of the same year, Brigham Young's doctrine of Adam is our God is published on the front page of the Millennial Star. So you couldn't have two bigger disasters in Victorian England. Unethical sex and abandonment of Trinity. Latter-day Saintism becomes weird. But there's no RLDS church in the British Isles. So many simply become inactive because there's no alternative. Many members are appalled about these developments. Now, the reorganization begins in 1851, started by Jason Briggs, who receives a revelation in Wisconsin. So Jason Briggs is an interesting character. I think he's an example of a leader who's unselfish. He doesn't want to have the #1 spot. He's opposed to polygamy. He hopes for Zion and quotes from the Book of Mormon, "Blessed are they who shall seek to bring forth my Zion at that day." And the early reorganization came to believe that Joseph III would be the next leader. And Joseph eventually was worked on by the Holy Spirit, felt the calling, and was ordained at the Amboy Conference in 1860. So let's tell a little bit now of Charles Derry's personal story. He's baptized at the tender age of 21. He's a blacksmith. This is 1847, when the church is really beginning to take off in the British Isles. He's ordained an elder 3 months later. He marries Anne in 1849, and they have a girl and a little boy. And he worked in the ministry full-time in the English Midlands for 6 years. And then, with his family, left Liverpool in March 1854. They arrive in New Orleans and then get on another boat, I guess a paddle steamer, to go up to Kansas City, up the Mississippi, and then you turn left in St. Louis to go to Kansas City on the Missouri. This is a 900-mile journey, 910. And then by ox cart, he goes from Kansas City to the Salt Lake Basin. Now, he's a blacksmith, so he's used to animals, but this is the first time he drives an ox cart. But they make a go of it. His wife tragically dies on the 7th of September, 3 or 4 weeks out from the Salt Lake Basin at a place called Ice Springs. And now he's left with 2 young children, one of whom, the little boy, is quite sick. They arrive in the Salt Lake Valley on the 30th of September, and he's digging potatoes 3 weeks later, and a British wagon train arrives with British immigrants. And he goes over to see who's there. And to be honest, he's looking for a wife to look after his children. So he's talking to one young woman, and then Eliza Herbert passes by. He doesn't know her, but senses in his spirit he should propose to her. So these are his first words to Eliza. I don't recommend this as a form of courtship, but this is what happened. He says, "Sister, my name is Charles Derry. I've been in this valley 3 weeks. My wife lies on yonder mountains, having been dead 7 weeks. I have 2 little children, one is sick. I have no home at present. I'm a blacksmith by trade, and I hope to be able to make a living. If under these conditions you will consent to be my wife and a mother to my children, I will be a husband to you in every sense of the word. Now, sisters, would you accept this proposal? Would you say yes?" I'm looking at Jewel in the corner, and she's not at all sure about this proposal. So Eliza says yes. And about 3 weeks later, they get married. So there is some time to get to know each other before they get married. And they're together for over 50 years. So here's the couple. Charles's eyes are quite weird in this photograph. Eliza looks normal. So the Great Salt Lake Valley, this is the city, Great Salt Lake City from the north, the normal grid pattern for American colonization. This is a traffic jam in the 60s. It would be similar, I think, in the 50s as well. So let's talk about Derry's 5 years in Utah. So he's employed straight away in the church's public works program, but 75% of his wages is withheld as tithing. That's a bit much, I think. And then he's cheated by the tithing office. Derry's own account said the office owed him $30, and he's meticulous about his records. The office said he owed $43. He found he'd been charged luxury items like silks that he'd not had. So he was upset about this. Remember, he's really poor. He has 2 bishops. He's a part of 2 wards, and they oppress and cheat him. So he's not happy about the pastoral care. It's tough in 1856 and 1857 because there are famines. Locusts come, and there are crop failures. So things are really tight. And then on top of this hardship, there's Brigham Young's Reformation. And this was an attempt to, this is pejoratively spoken, but whip the saints into line. So there's pressure to support celestial marriage, be polygamous. There's old men with child wives, reports Derry. Some women, he says, are driven to insanity. There's pressure to be loyal to Brigham Young. No one's allowed to leave. And if you're a dissenter, the Danites attack you. And he tells the story of Henry Jarvis. So the Reformation is not much fun. He hears what goes on in the temple endowment ceremonies. People are not supposed to talk about it, but they do. He doesn't make any comments because he has to be very careful with his words. But he realizes that if he goes to the temple and makes these solemn covenants, he could never leave because he would be killed. So he felt there were some oaths he could not make. And then in 1857, as the American Army, the US Army, was threatening Utah, he was mustered into the Nauvoo militia for 3 months to fight the US Army. So the Nauvoo Legion continues in Utah. That's very interesting, I think. But he says in his autobiography, I determined to shed no blood. So there's a kind of peace witness here, in uniform, but a conscientious objector. So he finally left the Great Salt Lake Valley on June the 3rd, 1859. He gets permission to leave. And he goes with a wagon train. He's lost faith not only in religion, but also in God. So these 5 years have been traumatic for him. He's united with his brother and mother in Fontanella. I hope I pronounced that right. If there's anybody who knows better, please let me know. In Nebraska, which is 53 miles northwest of Omaha. He'd written to his family when things were very sour in Utah to warn them not to come. They were following him. And then, remember, he's given up on God and religion. He reads the Reorganization's Herald on February the 6th, 1861. And all that sweet spirit comes back. A month later, he's baptized and ordained an elder the same day and begins missionary work. So we think of this hymn, O Lord, around thine altar now, as a communion hymn. I always thought of it as a communion hymn. But what he had in his home was a family altar around which the family would gather for their daily prayers. He had dismantled this when he lost faith. Now that he's found faith again, he puts back the altar for family prayers again. And he writes this hymn. So this hymn is about rediscovering faith, rediscovering grace after his traumatic experiences of dystopia in the Salt Lake Valley. And Jewel is going to sing this for us. So I'm going to, I better not mute because you won't be able to hear Jewel. So let's sing all the verses.
It's number 7 in Hymns of the Saints. O Lord, around thine altar now to supplicate thy grace. As children we would humbly bow and seek our Father's face. Hide not from us, our Father dear, thy gracious smiles we pray. But let thy love dispel our fear and draw us Let thy great light illume our souls and guide our erring feet. Thy spirit o'er us hold control and keep us from deceit. Then, gracious God, accept us now from thy great throne above. Help us to keep our sacred vow and fill us with thy love. Amen.
Thank you so much, Jewel. So there's a lovely spirit to that hymn, isn't there? And it was wonderful to find out the story behind the writing of this hymn. So he's really impressed with how Joseph Smith III deals with dissent and tells this story. So there's a brother with an axe to grind kept obstructing the business of this conference. And Joseph III bore with him very patiently until it was necessary to stop him. Then he arose, not in anger, and simply prayed. The result, a calm and peaceful, peace-loving spirit prevailed throughout the remainder of the conference. And he contrasts that with the behavior of Brigham Young in the same situation. So he's very impressed with the spiritual maturity of Joseph III. He also really likes that in the reorganization conferences, you can say what you think and vote according to your conscience and conviction, and there's no negative consequences from that. So, and that's very different from what he found out in Utah. So in the reorganized church, all things are done by common consent as the law of God directs. No man is questioned or snubbed for thinking and voting contrary to the majority. He likes this, and he does this. So he's also critical on one occasion, or a number of occasions, of Joseph III. And Joseph, at the beginning of the American Civil War, found himself in a Nauvoo meeting pressured to give a patriotic speech, and ends up recruiting volunteers for the Northern Army early in this war. Derry says this: Joseph III's forwardness in trying to gain favor for Zion, persuading young men to enlist in the war, has closed hearts of mothers and sisters against him, and they feel they owe their bereavements to him. I thank God that no mother mourns a son, no wife a husband, no child a father through my counsel or influence. I believe if any man thinks the saints ought to enlist in this war, he should himself set the example. So this is really quite clear criticism of Joseph III. Now, this is the only occasion in which Joseph III gives a war speech. He repents of this direction after this occasion. But I wonder if he's pushed by Charles Derry's criticism of this act. So I didn't realize that Charles Derry was on the peace road himself. In Nauvoo, he met Emma Smith. He says this of her: a woman of staid appearance, very intelligent. In fact, she appears to come near as being a good woman in every sense as you will generally meet. Makes me want to meet Emma. She's a good singer, we know that. And I cannot think how men can be so base as to misrepresent a woman that has trained up her children in honest industry and virtue, so that none that know them can bring the first accusation against them. The people of Nauvoo hold her in the highest esteem, and it only requires acquaintance to prove it all. So this is a lovely testimony, I think, of Emma Smith. And this is from somebody outside the family. So the reorganization early on in their conferences votes to approve resolutions to send missionaries to England and Wales. Remember, by 1852, 80% of all Latter-day Saints were British born and British baptized. Britain was such a fertile missionary field. So the early reorganization recognized this. But despite the resolutions, no one went. There were no volunteers. But Charles Derry volunteered, and he left home on the 6th of December, 1862. He was quite sick when he left home. Remember, he's relying on the church to look after his wife whilst he's gone. He arrives in England February the 4th and begins his missionary work. He's on his own. The first missionary teams that went in 1837 and 1840 were always teams. Nobody was on their own. When we first did missionary work in those early days, the doors were wide open. It was wildly successful. But now there's deep suspicion because of polygamy and dubious theology. He's lonely and often sick. And May the 11th, he found there were 4 heralds in the post office. And he's so lonely, he pawns his overcoat to get them. Now, would you pawn your coat to get a herald? 5 days later, Jason W. Briggs and Jeremiah joined Derry. And that's really good news, really heartens him. And they have enough money to buy back his coat from the pawnbrokers. He's also glad to receive through them a letter from Joseph III. And I find this quote from the letter really interesting. Derry quotes the whole letter in his autobiography. So Joseph says, "Today is a day of promise, and the light of prophecy beaming in on my mind tells me that the day is not far distant when the heralds of the reorganized church will be hailed the harbingers of peace and goodwill to men. When the hideous nightmare now holding the senses of so many spellbound shall give place to the opening influence of gospel truth and liberty, true liberty." So here we have evidence of already a shift in Joseph III's thinking, that the missionaries of Community of Christ, of the reorganized church, would be missionaries of peace and goodwill, of the gospel. Here's one typical encounter, perhaps, of his missionary work, where he's finding LDS folk and trying to tell them about the reorganization. So he meets with the Wilson family in Cheltenham. They were former members, but disillusioned with the evils that had crept into the church. The wife welcomes Derry kindly. The husband's very sour, surly. And so Derry says, "I talked kindly and explained our position to him, and his manner softened towards me so much that he invited me to stay and take supper with them and asked for forgiveness for his hard speeches initially." And Derry says, "Thus I proved again that a soft answer turneth away wrath," quoting Proverbs 15, verse 1. So Derry has some peacemaking skills too. He receives in February the 1st, 1864, a letter from home from his wife. And he says, "I'm sorry to learn that the branch at Council Bluffs is being rent asunder by a spirit of nationalism. He says, in the gospel, there's neither Jew nor Greek, all are one in Christ Jesus. I hope they will crush out the deadly viper of nationality and be united as the children of the kingdom of God." So Derry is critical of nationalism. So let's come to the first reorganized conference in Britain. So the second reorganized conference, the second church conference in 1838, April 1838, after 8 months of labor, reported 1,400 members, 26 branches being established, lots of people ordained. On Christmas Day, 100 children had been blessed. It's much more modest at this first reorganization conference. To get there, they walked from the Forest of Dean, which is near Gloucester, to Merthyr Tydfil, at this time the industrial capital of Wales. They arrive on Christmas Day. And there's a tea party for 247 people, which is, I think, lovely. And they hold the first general conference in Penydarren, which is kind of near Merthyr Tydfil, in December 26th and 27th, 1863. So Penydarren has a big ironworks there. There's 3 big ironworks in the Merthyr Tydfil area. In Merthyr Tydfil, you have coal and good quality iron ore. Jason Briggs is the chair. Charles Derry is the secretary. So just an aside about Penydarren, the first steam train in the world runs here. Here's the beast. Here's the Penydarren works, awful works. They called the bosses iron masters. It's almost slavery conditions. And the average life expectancy was 17.5 years. Lots of children died. And there's a book by Joe England about Merthyr Tydfil. And there's no toilets in Merthyr Tydfil. You walk in human excrement everywhere you go. So there's no wonder there's lots of disease. There's a roll call of the new branches and missionary reports of the reorganization. So 4 branches in Wales. Llanelli is still going. There's a really good story. Llanelli should be a story on its own. And Jewel and I shared with the saints in worship there this last Good Friday. And there are 2 branches at this point in England, both established by Charles Derry, West Bromwich in Birmingham and Lydney near Gloucester. 106 members, 38 elders, 13 priests, 2 teachers, 1 deacon. Lots of elders, folks. So missionary assignments are given at the conference. On the Sunday morning worship, Charles Derry spoke briefly, and then Jeremiah preached in Welsh. And this really is his name, Jeremiah. So it was very helpful to have a Welsh speaker. There's a proposal to begin a newspaper journal. And in the closing worship, Jason Briggs preaches. And just some of the topics of that sermon are interesting. He says, "We propose to consider the subject of priesthood in the Church of God, what it is, what it may do, and what it may not do. But we must understand that those holding this priesthood are not lawmakers, but simply administrators of the law, for God is our lawgiver." So here Jason Briggs is preaching a sermon saying that the reorganization are not innovators. They're faithful to the earlier Latter-day Saint gospel. And then he goes on to say, "Although we are few in number today, yet we shall be great, and many by and by. For God has said, Zion shall be the head, and not the tail. May God bless and protect and guide us in his kingdom, for Christ's sake. Amen." So again, you hear Jason Briggs' hope for Zion. And when I talk with some of my LDS Seeker friends, they say that we emphasize Zion more than the LDS tradition. And I think this goes back to the early days. So at the end of this first year of mission, Charles Derry adds up his receipts and gives an accounting. So he's received £24, 16 shillings, locally given. He's written 77 letters, that's 1.5 a week. He's published 1,000 of Joseph Smith III's letters. He walks everywhere except for 15 miles. He always had shelter, but not always a bed, he reports. So let's look at the walking. So he arrives in Liverpool, and Liverpool is approximately where the L is. If you move inland from the L in Liverpool, that's where the port of Liverpool is. He walks down to West Bromwich, and West Bromwich is where the W is in West. And then to Lydney, and then to Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. So what does this mean? So from Liverpool to West Bromwich is 97 miles. It takes him 5 days. That's walking 20 miles a day. That's a decent walk, folks. That's hard. And this is in all weathers. Remember, rarely sun shines in Britain. It rains a lot. From West Bromwich to Lydney is 74 miles. And from Lydney to Merthyr Tydfil is 46 miles. He goes back to the States to be with his family after this mission trip, and he arrives in Castle Gardens, Port of New York, which was America's first immigration center, operates for 72 years. He says in his diary entry, 7th of August, 1864, I saw a boatload of wounded soldiers. Some were badly wounded. War, thou art a cruel thing. Child of evil, born of envy, nursed by hate and cruel ambition, fostered by pride, lust, and greed. Earth and its inhabitants will rejoice when thy cruel reign is over, and those demon passions which give thee birth and fostered thee are forever destroyed. So that's the mission trip. But then I find out he's quite important in the later reorganization. So let's look briefly at that. He's an apostle for 5 years and then resigns. Joseph III's really upset. But this is what he says, what Charles Derry says. I think I have good evidence that God did not call me to be an apostle from the fact that I have not and never did have any evidence that he called me to that high position. Others claim that they have evidence that I was called of God, but apostles go not by other men's evidence. They must have it for themselves. So that's very interesting. But he's not on his way out. 20 years later or so, or 12 years later, he says, this will be a typical year. Again, he's giving an accounting as he looks back on December the 31st for the year. During this year, I preached 122 discourses, baptized 10 persons, delivered my exhortations in public and private, have visited widows and others, administered to the sick by night and by day, have used my influence on behalf of Sabbath schools and camp meetings, have written various articles for the Herald, also private letters on doctrine to strengthen members in the church, as well as ordaining men to the ministry. They have tried to be in harmony with my brethren without compromising principles. So I think that's impressive ministry. I mean, 10 years at 10 persons a year, it's 100 people. So his later ministry, it has to be said that he's close to Joseph. Norma Derry Hiles, a descendant of Charles, who's quite critical of him, in her John Whitmer essay says, for almost 50 years, Charles Derry was involved in most of the major decision-making, doctrinal and procedural changes, quorum realignments, and editorial policies that were at issue in the reorganization. So Charles Derry is exercising leadership. He's president of the High Priest Quorum for nearly 20 years. And he makes the quorum of significance in the reorganization. So if you're a high priest out there, Charles Derry helped your quorum have a life in the reorganization. He's a member of the Standing High Council for 12 years. He's ordained a patriarch in 1902, and he's superannuated in 1907. And he's 81 by this point. I think he deserves retirement. And he dies in 1921. So if we were to summarize Charles Derry's life, it would be this: British saint, LDS seeker, prairie preacher, dynamic leader. Was a full-time missionary for 45 years, with a break of 5 years in Utah. Traveled without purse or scrip despite back pain. He didn't have ministerial reimbursement. First foreign missionary, preached the first sermon and baptized the first person in England. Not a negotiator, and sometimes a person of contradiction. Had conflicts, including with Jason Briggs and Mark Forscott, who you heard about last week. As I've said, he was close to Joseph III and W. Blair in the First Presidency and others. He was the prime mover for reunion. Our reunion tradition comes from him. He's tolerant of a brother who played a violin in a dance hall. I think that's quite good. He's the first to sponsor a resolution that alcoholism was a disease And therefore, alcoholics should have the ministry of the church. I think that's remarkable. He's against discrimination of blacks back in 1866. He's the first to push for Sunday schools. He's a writer, poet, journalist, letter writer, and hymn writer. He's horrified by war. He's embraced peace as part of the mission of the gospel. He gave his all to the restoration and the reorganization. If I were to meet him, I think I would love him. Charles Derry.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your research with us this evening and for helping us gain a greater understanding of Charles Derry's life and legacy. And it's time to bring our program today to a close. So thank you, Peter and Barb, for helping out behind the scenes. And lastly, we share our thanks to you, our friends out in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites with your donations. Thank you for your support. I encourage you to tune in next week as we welcome Tony Chavalis-Smith to the Spring Lecture Series. Tony will take a deep dive into the history of Community of Christ theology and identity in a presentation that he's calling Doctrinal Self-Definition and the Construction of an RLDS Theology and Theological Identity. Tony's presentation will begin at 7:00 p.m. Central Time next Thursday, so be sure to mark that on your calendars and go ahead and register. Barb's already dropped a link to the Spring Lecture Series webpage in the chat box, so be sure to take that link to register for next week's program. So until next Thursday, take care, everyone. Keep reading your church history and have a good night.